The following is an interview I recorded with Dr. Mark Vernon, who recently published a book on the poet William Blake. In the interview, we discuss Blake's significance for today, his view of the imagination as not only incredibly important, but in a sense primordial, Blake's unique conception of infinity and eternity not as boundless static quantities, but as dynamic qualities in particular moments or things. We also talk about Blake's affirmation of both contraries or polarities that we find in existence, attraction and repulsion, reason and energy, love and hate, as Blake puts it, but also how he holds that nevertheless one of these contraries is primary. We explore Blake's relation to the Neoplatonic, Hindu, and Christian traditions, and in particular his deepening understanding of and reverence for the figure of Jesus. We also touch on the remarkable similarity of Blake's thought to that of Nietzsche, why this might be, since there's no evidence the German philosopher ever read him, and what might nevertheless be a couple of crucial differences between the two. In some of his most famous verses, Blake talks about what it is to see a world in a grain of sand and heaven in a wildflower. Hold infinity in the palm of your hand and eternity in an hour. Though our talk was a little more than an hour, and Mark graciously extended it, I certainly felt in it the presence of eternity, that it not only pointed to, but in a way embodied that ultimate level of being whence all things come. I hope it may have a similar effect for you as you listen along. Since I prefer not to show my face, we decided just to post the audio. It will be accompanied by various paintings and illustrations by Blake. I'm incredibly grateful to Mark for his time and his work, and if you like what you hear, I strongly recommend getting his book. I'll post a link to it in the description. And now, without further ado, Mark Vernon. I'm talking today with Dr. Mark Vernon, psychotherapist, writer, I think it's fair to say maybe philosopher. Seems he's been many things. And we'll be talking about his most recent book on the English poet William Blake, titled Awake, William Blake and the Power of the Imagination. So Mark, thank you for joining me today.
Hey, look, thanks for inviting me on. I like talking about these things, and I hope it brings it to life for people as well, because Blake was a prophet. He has something to say to us.
And I should also thank you for writing the book, because I found it really brilliant, really engaging, almost bringing some of the enchantment of Blake to life, as well as being quite sort of intellectual at the same time. And so I guess just to start out, I have a few specific questions. Maybe I should say just a very brief few words about how I came to Blake. So I came to Blake quite recently. I've only read very few of his works. After I read your book, I actually delved into Milton, his poem Milton, big poem Milton, and the first book of Urizen. Before that, I'd only read The Marriage of Heaven and Hell, which I found fascinating, and the songs as well. So very short, in a certain way, simple poems, in a certain way, not. And I kind of came to him through some conversations I'd been having around Nietzsche in the Book of Job. And so Blake to me stood out as someone that potentially maybe unites a Nietzschean mentality with a Christian mentality, which has always been a big theme. It's a big theme in my channel. It's a big theme with the sort of things that I've been thinking of for the last few years. And so that's why Blake stood out to me. And then I saw that your book had come out. So I thought this would be a great opportunity to dive a bit deeper, learn a bit more about his life, learn a bit more about his poetry. And like I said, I think you do a wonderful job of that with your book. So just before we get into some more sort of specific, maybe even philosophical questions, do you want to just talk a little bit about, first of all, who Blake is for maybe some viewers that aren't familiar with him? And secondly, why he's significant? Because And people tend to take a long time to write books and put a lot of effort into them. And there's usually, a strong motivating reason. So why did you write this book, and why do you think it's significant now?
Maybe I'll start with the second question first.
Okay.
It's partly because I'm very drawn myself to mysticism in inner life, and Blake is my local mystic. I live in South London, and I'd read a number of mystics, and Blake, as it were, breathed the same air that I breathe, walked the same streets, writes in English, so you don't have to read in translation or try and read Middle German or something. And so there's something about connection with Blake that is very important to me. He also, as we'll no doubt get onto, is a Christian mystic of the poorest kind. So Christianity is sort of the place he stands from, but it opens him to all sorts of common strands in mystical traditions. And he's one of these figures who is instantly recognizable as brilliant. Who doesn't love phrases like "to see a world in a grain of sand and a heaven in a wild flower," and many others, but can take you into real depth because, poems like the one you mentioned there, Milton, it takes time to really feel into, let it work on you, let it really shift your perspective. And so he can become a long-standing friend. And he thought he was writing inspired texts, and I think they are, because they transmit more and more the more that you get into them. But it does take some effort to get into him, and so it's really heartening for me that you found the book useful in that respect, because it's very much about that. Who he was and why he matters now. He's a Georgian figure. His dates are 1757 to 1827. So his 200th anniversary of his death's coming up in next year, actually. So I'm hoping there's going to be a bit of a return to Blake. And he's significant, I think, because, as many historians now recognize, that period is one in which many of the assumptions that we now take for granted were bedding down about the way the world is, both politically and economically, but also spiritually, ontologically as well. And so he saw it coming, and because he has this spiritual analysis, this inner analysis of what's going on, and can convey it actually sometimes in quite philosophical statements, but also through the poetry, through the imagery. I think he becomes even more important now that so much that he saw beginning to emerge is now quite apparent and manifest. And in a world that many find difficult to understand, and feel that there's a whole lot of far fighting going on, not really clear about how to welcome what is being born in the modern period, as well as fearing what might be happening. That combination, I think, is really crucial. Blake helps us very much. It's a time when, I don't know, left and right in politics is first defined after the French Revolution. It's a time when the dark satanic mills, as Blake puts it, the sense that the mechanistic account of reality was really bedding down. It's a time when words like nihilism, talking of Nietzsche, whether or not Nietzsche is a nihilist, of course, is moot, but nonetheless, the possibility of what Nietzsche did come to call the death of God, the assumption that the world is basically meaningless and it's up to us to generate meaning somehow. That was, Blake spotted that coming. It's also the time when men stopped wearing powdered wigs and knitted tights and started wearing trousers because of the way that the sailors became heroes in the Napoleonic Wars. But that's also to say it's a time of deep conflict and war as well. England was either at war or there was the threat of war with France as the European powers struggled to maintain their empires and secure global hegemony and things. So it's a time of great excitement, new ideas, the opening up of worlds, lots of ideas from India, from the Americas coming into Blake's London, but also the time of conflict, of slavery, and all the darkness of the modern age as well. So he's a figure who can keep saying yes to life, bring all this together, and so he's immensely helpful to us now.
Yeah, that's wonderful. And I got a sense reading your book that here's an alternate vision of the world, let's say, or reality. Here's a possibility that's not just sort of materialistic nihilism, but something far richer. But I think to the point of what you were saying, this came about in Blake in a time of massive transition. It's when we were moving into the modern era. It's when we were moving into that very mechanistic, materialistic framework. And I think that's what makes him so evocative and rich, because he's actually grappling with this. He's not, it's different perhaps than looking to an ancient writer or even a medieval writer, where they're not already grappling with the same things. And so even by the way, I think politically, like reading Blake, it's kind of hard to pin him. There's a certain conservative tendency, there's radical tendencies, and it's very hard to sort of pin him on the spectrum that, like you said, was emerging at that very time. And I think that's a virtue. But I want to talk briefly, or I want to ask you about his ontology. So this alternative vision, it seems to be centered in the imagination, and that's, of course, in the title of your book. It's a major theme in the book, the power of the imagination. And you talk quite a lot about the power of the imagination, the necessity of it, even the way that it kind of permeates all good things about actual living. Um, and so I don't so much want to ask you about that, but I want to ask you a deeper question that, at least to my eyes, and I've only read through it once, so maybe I missed it to a degree, but the ontology of imagination. What is it? What's its nature? Because I can see its importance, but I'm still a little bit in the dark about how Blake saw it. So, for instance, you mention a story in the book where, he talks about some vision, I think a bucolic scene transforming before his eyes. And then a lady asks him, "Where do I go to see this?" And he taps his forehead or something like that to imply that, it wasn't external to him. But on the other hand, it doesn't seem that imagination for him is purely subjective either. And so I think that raises some interesting questions. I was recently reading Henry Corbin, who sort of has this idea of the imaginal realm as being something at least somewhat objective, certainly not merely subjective. And then, of course, you have the archetypes of Jung, which have an objective quality to them. Where do you place Blake in all of this? How would you describe his ontology of the imagination?
I mean, you can give an answer in a word, which is that the imagination is divine.
Mm.
It is God's presence, activity, manifestation in all things. And that means that it can be also synonymous, well, with Jesus, is very explicit in Blake. He often talks about Jesus, the imagination. And what he's referring to there is the figure of Jesus being what's called the logos in Christian theology, which is a Greek word for word, but it means the kind of the creative word. It's a bit, it's a word that does something. If I shout fire, fire, we think about fleeing the room. And so it's like a tendency, an allure, a power that's drawing all things to itself. And so I think Blake is very much part of the Neoplatonic tradition in that sense. The good, the beautiful, and the true matters to him. And if you follow those imperatives through your imagination and seeing how the imagination that's in all things, in all forms, in all creatures, is drawing to God through that which is good, beautiful, and true, then that's very much part of the imagination for Blake. So by contrast, it's not how we often, I think, talk about imagination now, which is as if it's a kind of private possession, somehow a bit generated within me, maybe a bit more generated within you, even more so in a few creatives like William Blake. Blake says, no, that's to completely get it the wrong way round. We can collude and align and co-create with that divine imagination, and that's very much part of the human vocation. But I think another important element, which Blake critiques, because he saw this emerging in his time too, is to correct the notion that somehow that which is immanent is separate from that which is transcendent. This idea of a God afar off was born in Blake's time. It was called deism. And of course, a God that's afar off can quite easily become a God that doesn't exist at all. And so Georgian deism becomes Victorian atheism. But what Blake understood, which is actually at the heart of all the mystics, and it is in his phrase, like to see a world in a grain of sand, is that transcendence is actually discovered by going into the heart of things, and then things open up and open up and open up. And so the transcendent is at once our source, and in that sense, more than us, and as divine creatures, again, is identified with God ontologically, but is also known, absolutely within us, and by paying attention. The more you can, the closer you can get to that which is already closer to you, the more you discover the transcendent. I mean, this isn't a mystery amongst mystics. St. Augustine will talk about God being closer to ourselves than we are to ourselves. And Blake's recovering that, in contradistinction to deism, and also to the more general Reformation assertion, really, that interiority is not to be trusted. Both Luther and Calvin had a deep, deep trust of inner life. And immediately this produces a response, of course. The post-Reformation mystics, of which Blake is one, react against that. So the ontological nature of the imagination is divine, and it is the... you can't not be in the imagination, and put it like that. I mean, we're talking, for example, and as a physicist would have it, I'm creating vibrations on the air that get converted into electromagnetic signals that can get transferred down fiber optic cables and so on, and they pop up on your screen and get converted back into oscillations on the air. But of course, we don't hear oscillations on the air. We hear words, and moreover, words that we hope are full of meaning, and moreover, are taking us and listeners to all sorts of parallel worlds and dimensions and facets of existence. Now, that is the imagination always at work within us. If it weren't, we just hear meaningless oscillations. So you don't have to worry about whether you have imagination or not. You do. The question is how conscious you become of it, and therefore become more and more aware of participating in the divine life.
It sounds like Blake's view of the imagination is that it's sort of ontologically primary. It's actually fundamental. Would you go as far as to say maybe that for Blake, the whole cosmos is the imagination of God, or divine imagination?
Yes, I think that it's a parallel thought to classical theism, which understands that it's in the nature of God to overflow. There's an excessiveness in the infinity of God that's always pouring out, and that is the creative act. And Blake gives it this extra sort of he uses the description of the imagination because I think he feels that gets closer to the abundance of the divine. The trouble with saying God's a creator is that which is true, I think, but nonetheless, certainly in Blake's time, and I think in ours, through deism, it inclines to the assumption that God might be a kind of great engineer or a great designer, as if God was sort of standing back from creation and twiddling the knobs and intervening every so often with the occasional miracle. Still quite a common assumption about God. And Blake says, no, that's to completely misunderstand the divine nature. It's always already more intimate in all things than we are. So the miracle is not the exception. In a way, the miracle is the continual presence of God. In theology, it's sometimes called occasionalism. If people are into theology, this understanding of God as well.
Mm. And maybe not miracle, but the exception is almost the mechanistic science in a way. That's the most unnatural thing. That's the most abstracted thing from the fundamental thing, if you will, that we experience, which is imagination. Um, I want to pick up on something that you sort of referred to, which was the relation between the transcendent and the immanent. And in Blake, and perhaps in all poets, but especially in Blake, because it's done in a very self-conscious way, the transcendent and immanent are really brought into a deep connection. It's almost like concepts become concrete for Blake in his, I think you call them superheroes or his deities or whatever you want to call them. Um, and so I wanted to ask a question about that, specifically about eternity and infinity. So I was recently listening to a talk by Iain McGilchrist. It was the Sophia, one of the Sophia talks he gave at Ralston College, and it was his third talk. He was talking about infinity and eternity, and referring to Blake. And he actually mentioned that the word infinite or some variation of it occurs in Blake's corpus 71 times, and the word eternity 681 times. And then he mentions how vastly more that is than any of the other romantic poets. And so Blake is almost obsessed with eternity in a good way, I would say, but it's a very common theme. But what's so striking to me is the way that he treats it. And I think what was so striking to McGilchrist as well is how he treats it in such a dynamic, qualitative, concrete manner. Very different, I think, to how I tend to think about infinity, and I think a lot of people do, which is sort of just like an abstraction, a vast, unimaginable number, something like that. Um, and he even says, in sort of a very philosophical way, Blake says, the infinite alone resides in definite and determinate identity. So a very paradoxical statement. And then, of course, the famous lines that you referred to before, to see a world in a grain of sand and heaven in a wildflower, hold infinity in the palm of your hand and eternity in an hour. And so I wonder if you could just talk a bit more about that, about the idea of eternity or infinity that isn't just some unimaginably large quantity, but has this kind of immanent qualitative aspect. What does he mean by that exactly?
Here's another phrase of Blake that I hope will help us get into that. He writes, "There is a there is a moment in every day that Satan cannot find, nor can his watch fiends find it. But the industrious find this moment, and it multiply. And when it once is found, it renovates every moment of the day, if rightly placed." And so that is to talk about infinity and eternity in terms of time. There's a moment in each day. And of course, it's not about finding the moment's not 10 past 2 or something. The moment is what in the Greek would be called the chirological time rather than the chronological time. So this is, the right moment, the moment of perception, the moment of insight, the moment of a glimpse. And that is how the eternal and the infinite come to us. It's the depth of every moment, rather than the extension indefinitely of every moment. It's not about quantity, but about quality and seeing through to the true nature of things, not just accumulating more and more and more things. So that's how the infinite is concrete, and is not just abstract, but is known in what Blake calls the minute particulars, that include the grain of sand and the wild flower, but of course include everything too. And so true industriousness, to go back to this quote, the industrious find this moment in it multiply, and when it once is found, it renovates every moment of the day. I love these words, industrious and renovation, because again, they seem quite mechanical words, from the Industrial Revolution, something that we kind of do and work on and, improve and so on. But Blake's saying, no, true industriousness is when the spirit connects with the divine spirit. And through this chirological moment, there's an outpouring, an influx of that which already is, that renovates. And of course, it's our perception that's been renovated. And so when we can rightly place that, i.e. when we can bring what maybe at one point in our lives was an exceptional experience, and that can become seeing every moment of the day is of this quality, then you start to gain the perspective from which is the only true perspective, which is the eternal perspective. It's the divine perspective that we become separated from, or have lost sight of, which Blake famously calls single vision and Newton's sleep. And this is to also sort of step out of yourself. It's to re-identify who you truly are, which is, as Blake also puts, part of the one body of humanity, of Jesus. And so another really, I think, important aspect of this shift of perspective, which is really the return to the true perspective of eternity, is tackling what Blake called selfhood. And so this is the assumption that somehow I'm in my skull, you're in your skull. Consciousness is somehow generated from the wet matter in our heads, and we sort of beaming out in some fairly pathetic manner, trying to put color into an otherwise dead cosmos. A sort of standard model of consciousness these days that shapes much neuroscience and so on. And Blake's saying that's completely wrong. What is really going on when we're aware is an awakening within us of that which is all around us, and that therefore enables us to let go of ourselves and this narrowed, which Blake would call satanic, perception that's very much in the culture. And so it's a real struggle, because most things around us tell us, no, you're this autonomous, isolated individual. And when Blake talks about cleansing the doors of perception, he's talking about really cleansing the philosophy that tell you that what should be windows of perception have become doors of perception, closing you in, rather than the senses being known as portals or thresholds. And this happens when all that you have, you offer to all that's coming towards you, and you're, as it were, sharing that abundance, meets the source of the abundance of all things. And so it's a joyful outpouring of yourself that meets the joyful outpouring of the divine in all things, and discovers, therefore, your true nature. So this overcoming of selfhood, which again, in many Christian circles can be seen as I feel it's often a slightly sort of masochistic, certainly moralizing sense, that you've got to sort of sacrifice yourself somehow. But Blake, I think, understood the true nature of sacrifice, which is it's the offering back of that which has already been offered to you. And so it's actually a mutual meeting in abundance. And that's why, words again like infinity and eternity are so appropriate here. And because it's the meeting of that which is infinite, the meeting of that which is eternal. And, so Blake, one more phrase, that I think really captures this, and that this is part of the genius of Blake too. It's the energy that's in the lines that somehow draw you towards this way of being in the world when he writes, he who binds to himself the joy, does the winged life destroy? He who kisses the joy as it flies lives in eternity's sunrise. So binding and possession and accumulation are so much the drivers of our times. When Blake's saying no, it's kissing, it's letting go, it's opening up that enables living in eternity's sunrise.
I love that emphasis on abundance in the sense that, like you said, the self-giving, the self-sacrifice isn't a masochistic thing, but it's sort of in a way a joyful thing, in a way a creative thing, in a way an energetic thing, and I guess that's what Blake's really picking up on and kind of opposing to this kind of, I don't know if you want to call it stoic, but certainly like this more hard view of I have to discipline myself, I have to restrain myself, I have to negate myself. And I love that a lot. And I think that to sort of skip ahead maybe a little bit, that goes to that kind of fusion between Nietzsche, who certainly was about that exuberance, that energy, that abundance, and Christianity, which is certainly about self-sacrifice, and that the two do not have to be mutually exclusive. And maybe on that note, that's actually a good seg into my next question, which is around contraries and negation. Um, so it seems like contraries are another one of Blake's chief themes. And so in Marriage of Heaven and Hell, a relatively early book, and for me, relatively easier to understand than, say, Milton, which came later, he says, without contraries is no progression. Attraction and repulsion, reason and energy, love and hate are necessary to human existence. But then later in Milton, he does say, contraries are positive, a negation is not a contrary. And you pointed this out, of course, in your book. And he also says the negation must be destroyed to redeem the contraries. Um, so I must admit, this is at least a little bit mysterious to me because you've got contraries, but then you've also got negation and this sort of redemptive process or potential redemptive process. How do you distinguish between a contrary and a negation? And having so distinguished, how would you destroy the negation to redeem the contraries? What do you think that Blake is getting at here?
I mean, maybe an analogy is helpful, and I think it's one that did inform Blake, which involves substituting the word contraries for polarities, which I think Blake doesn't use the word polar or polarity, but I think it's faithful to him, which is to reference the emerging science of electromagnetism. He's near contemporary, at least, of figures like Faraday, and you'll know if you have a bar magnet that it has a north pole and a south pole, but those two poles exist to hold the field of the magnet, the energetics of the magnet. And I think that Blake is saying that when we can hold the polarities of life, the contraries, but not be identified with one or the other, then we can enter into the field of life, which is the actual vitality itself. Again, it's where the energy is, where the exuberance is, where the dynamism is, the imagination is. But there's a terrible tendency in the modern mind to not want to enter the field, but to somehow try and assume what philosophers sometimes call the view from nowhere. A word like objective was becoming really important in Blake's time, as if the objective viewpoint was the place from which truth could be discerned. And Blake's saying no, it's from immersion in life, in the subjective, that the truth is known, because then it asks all that you are to meet all that it is, rather than this useful in some respects but abstracted perspective, as if you could be from nowhere. And I think this is what Blake means by negation, that if you feel that you can best understand life by taking yourself out of life, then you have negated life. And that is the viewpoint put by what Blake calls the spectre. And I think this is a pun on the spectator, as if the spectator perspective is best, which, observing in a test tube or considering an abstract philosophy, whatever, however it manifests itself, the spectator view, the spectre, tries to seduce you that somehow it's going to offer you the true perspective. And particularly the figure of loss in Blake's later poems has to understand his spectre and what it is, because these things, that there's always a truth. Blake's clear, there is a desire to know what's true. There is a desire to understand what's going to fulfill us. And desire is always really, really important. You must never negate your desire as well, because then you lose your capacity to live. But on the other hand, the spectator perspective, the spectre, is telling you falsehoods woven into what it's truly trying to follow. And so these things must be wrestled with as well. But that's roughly, I think, what Blake means by without contraries, there's no progression. And again, I love the way that he uses the word progression, because we normally think of that in terms of accumulation or sort of advance. But he's saying, no, it's kind of like a movement back into the divine. He's using progression in the older sense, when I don't know, Elizabeth I went on a progress, which is the origins of the word. It was like a journey around the country. And then it only, in Blake's time, comes to mean a kind of one-way development towards things getting better and better. Blake's saying, no, progress back into God. And that happens by entering the field between the contraries. He also, another phrase of his is opposition is true friendship. And I think he's referring to the same dynamic there. And avoiding the negation, which is this viewpoint of the spectre, that somehow to take yourself out of the field of life is the vantage to have.
That's very helpful. So it sounds like when we dealing with a negation, it's something that is sort of abstracted, or it's something that is disengaged or disengages us. Whereas when we're dealing with contraries, if we're dealing with them sort of forthrightly or genuinely, it makes us more engaged, more embodied, more alive. And so that makes sense why he would distinguish between the two. Like the negation isn't a true contrary; it's a kind of shadow or a mirage or something like that, regression from the divine. There's another aspect to contraries that I also wanted to ask about and talk about to a small extent as well, which is their asymmetric relation. So, in your book, you say the creed embraces both and. I think you're talking about sort of Blake's general creed about contraries, embraces both and rather than treating life as a series of either or choices, though Blake's contraries are not equal and opposite, but asymmetric. This is crucial. One pole is prior, namely, the one that taps more fully into the well springs of life. And in Marriage of Heaven and Hell, Blake says, energy is energy is the only life and is from the body, and reason is the bound or outer circumference of energy. So there's a hierarchical relationship, or at least a relationship of primacy there, where reason is both the contrary of energy, but also somewhat subordinate to it or subsidiary to it or something like that. And I find that idea absolutely fascinating. I think within the last year or two, I've sort of started to see it everywhere. It started when I read Iain McGilchrist's book, more recent book, Matter with Things. And of course, for him, that pattern is embodied in the human hemispheres, the human brain hemispheres, where the right hemisphere, in a certain way, embraces the left hemisphere because it can see more of what the left hemisphere can, which has very focused, narrow attention. But that doesn't mean it can simply replace the left hemisphere. So there's still a contrary relation, there's still opposites. And yet at the same time, one is more primary than the other. So to see this turn up in Blake was also fascinating for me as well. I've sort of been thinking about, I'll read you another quote from McGilchrist, because this is also what helped me a lot in thinking about the role of evil, suffering, and the problem of evil. Um, so this is from his book, The Matter with Things. He says, I experience both good and evil as real and see them as necessary opposites. But while evil can, goodness knows, locally overwhelm good, it cannot subsume good into itself. The goodness of love can embrace its opposite. The evil of hate cannot. So then I started thinking about good and evil as opposites, and it occurred to me that there's maybe a capital G good and a lowercase g good. There's a good that's in opposition to evil, and there's a good that subsumes both. And so one of the opposites subsumes both. It's not that there's a neutral third thing that subsumes both, like something that's neither good nor evil. It's that there's a higher level of good. And so I also saw the same pattern in the book of Job. Um, and so this is really, really interesting and really meaningful to me. So I don't know if I have a specific question. I was just wondering, sort of what you think about that idea, that basic asymmetric relation. How deep does it go? And yeah, I guess in Blake, in your own thought, what do you think about that?
Yeah, thank you. These are really wonderful reflections, and I mean, I think that Blake actually, again, is being just very orthodox here, but it's an orthodoxy that has rather got lost sight of. And the orthodoxy in this case, at least one facet of it, would be the orthodoxy that's known as the privatio bonum. So this is the sense that take the contraries of good and evil. The evil is not a thing in itself. It's not. This is not a dualistic or Manichaean worldview that Blake has at all. Evil is a privation of the good, is a lack of good or a form of ignorance. Hence, the Latin phrase privatio bonum. And what this means, therefore, is that the good already contains that which is evil, but evil is to use the spatial metaphor, is sort of smaller than the good. It's a loss of good. Now, evil seems to have a life of its own because within the domain of that which is evil, desire is still fully operative. There's still the yearning for God. But because it lacks the good that God is, it turns in on itself and manifests in the horrors which undoubtedly exist as well. But the way to, you might say, approach evil is to try and recognize the good that still remains within it, and to call forth to that good. There may be all sorts of intermediary things you need to do, like binding evil, for example. It may need the desire controlling in one way or another, and so this would manifest, for example, in imprisonment, even for sins. But to never lose sight of the good that's in this case, the person too. And so this for me is at once a kind of philosophical view of the nature of between good and evil, but it's also very practical because we feel that we meet these evils all day, every day. But if you try and combat them as if they were polar, were absolute opposites that need to be somehow got rid of, then you end up going crazy because you're getting caught up in the same sort of philosophy of absence, or philosophy of what's the word? Not paucity. Of decline, or philosophy of
Scarcity.
I can't remember the word. Anyway, the opposite of abundance. This is what I'm getting to. Yeah. Whereas to say no, there can only really the good is always present. The question is how to call to it, and to bring it back to its senses and so on. This I think is the sane way to go. Yeah, so that this asymmetry is really important. So you talked about energy and reason, and you can visualize what reason is. Reason is not a sovereign power that can decide all things to itself. And the minute you think about what reason actually is, reason has an inner dynamic. Logic
Mm.
inclines in a certain direction. 1+1 = 2. You feel the pull of that equation. So you see actually that reason is a form of energy. It's just a very particularly focused form of energy. And so the general is the energetic, and reason is one way of working with energy. And reason's great gift, if you like, to energy is that it can help focus it. It can take energy and apply it to particular situations like mathematics. But to think somehow that reason therefore can do without the energies is not even to have understood what reason is. And again, I think the reason why people feel that is because they lose touch with the inner dynamics of reason, assuming it has these objective qualities again, these spectator qualities again. But if you've ever tried to work anything out logically, the thrill. It's an exciting thing to do. Maths naturally gets called beautiful, and again, that's because it takes part in this particular form of energy. So I think again, it's another wonderful thing to start to get a taste of in the modern world that can feel, so empty, dangerous, and so on as well. I know that there's focus on the good and invoke that energy, and then eternity's sunrise starts to appear once more.
It's interesting you brought up the provatio boni, because I was thinking about, first of all, Jung's kind of opposition to that, of sort of that diminishes the reality of evil, that diminishes even the sort of importance of evil or things that we take to be evil. I wonder if Blake's more radical on this. I wonder if he's saying that actually evil has a certain degree of reality of its own. It's not mere absence, but it's still subsidiary. It's still subordinate. Um, and that's what I feel anyway. And that's why I feel that there's maybe more of a connection with Nietzsche, who would be more inclined to more, let's say, forcefully affirm both those contraries. Um, uh, but I see that maybe Blake can also be placed in that more traditional theology as well.
Yeah, I mean, I would really I think this is, it's a philosophical point, but I do think it
Mm,
has real world ramifications, because I think, Jung's a complicated figure, Nietzsche's a complicated figure. It's hard to summarize them because, they do tend to say different things in different places. And of course, they're questing, so they would. But I think that there's a tendency in Jung, and I think Nietzsche, I don't know Nietzsche quite so well, but to be preoccupied with what you might call penultimate things rather than
mm,
ultimate things. Um, and if you do that, then you forget really the source of evil as being the loss of good, because you've lost contact with the good as an ultimate.
mm,
You're tending to flatten things out a bit, and in a engage, when you get engaged with penultimate things that can lead you to the ultimate, then you that's when the disorientation starts to occur, and the loss of the true relationship between things. So I think actually it's really actually quite important to insist that evil is nothing in itself.
mm,
When, for example, Jung inclines to quatrains, feeling that the evil needs to be added to the Trinity of God, for example, and then he might look to Blake and see that Blake talks about fourfold vision and think, there we are, it is in Blake. But actually, for Blake, fourfold vision is the one vision, that it's the four that completes the three. And so it actually is a version of Trinitarianism in Christianity, which always insists that it's three in one and one in three. It's not, the one does not add to the three. The one is the fulfillment of the three. Yeah, so these things can sound a bit like sort of puzzles in your head, but they do have very practical ramifications in terms of how we perceive the world.
Hmm. Yeah, I take your point, and I think that it's good to think about it in terms of those levels, that there's a way to talk about it on an ultimate level, and there's a way to talk about it on a relative level, where perhaps you might want to, let's say there might be a way to misapply the ultimate level to the relative in a way that you say that I need to escape this material world of evil or something like that, or I need to subdue it. Maybe that's what Jung was afraid of. Um, I want to move on to talk a little bit about Platonism, because I can't remember, I couldn't find it in the index, so I can't remember if you explicitly make this connection in the book between Neoplatonism and Blake, but I've definitely heard you talk about it online. Um, and so I was wondering if you could talk about that. I know you do note in the book that Blake was friends with Thomas Taylor, so he was a sort of Neoplatonist translator of ancient philosophy at the time. And I also see some of the language of Neoplatonism, one of the most obvious examples being emanations, of course. I guess what maybe puzzles me a little bit is, so for Neoplatonism, you have this sort of trinity of the one emanating into the intellect or the nous, emanating into the soul. And then in Blake, the you sort of have energy being primary and reason being subsidiary or something like that. And on the surface, it would seem that maybe you could link intellect with reason and soul with energy, which would kind of make Blake out of sync with that Neoplatonic structure. Um, do you see that a bit differently? And maybe can you speak as well, just in general, about the connections you see between Blake and Neoplatonism?
Yeah. Instead, I just want to say thank you for making that point about Jung, because I think that just the point you made about Jung there is a really good one, actually. At the end there about how um, uh, there is a really important way in which we must engage life at the relative level, to but to find the liberation, and Blake has that. When loss is wrestling with his spectre, you might say that is engaging with things at the relative level. So thank you for adding that. To come to Neoplatonism, yeah, I think Blake absolutely is in the Neoplatonic tradition. He might be more in the part of that tradition that, I don't know, you can associate with a figure like Iamblichus rather than, say, Plotinus, although people argue whether there's really much difference between the two. But the only reason why I say that is because I think Blake did feel that, as it were, the divine soul was fully descended into the material realm, rather than sort of hovering above it, which is sometimes how Plotinus is presented. I think that probably is a misunderstanding of Plotinus, actually, but that's another podcast. But yeah, Blake, I think he does talk about how the writings of Plato and others have been stolen and perverted by figures in his time. And I think what he's particularly referring to there is the way that the Republic, say, Plato's dialogue, the Republic, was starting to be read as if it was a manifesto for the British ruling the empire. There was the need for the philosopher kings. They often overlooked that Plato had philosopher queens as well. But nonetheless, for the philosopher kings to, as it were, go out and rule the masses of the workers and so on. And this is a kind of horrific concretization of Plato, as if the Republic is a manifesto. But still, to this day, is how the Republic's read. People will say, but didn't Plato ban poets and stuff like this? Forgetting that the Republic is an exploration that is supposed to be an education by making you think through various options, not settling on this is what to do. Precisely, that's why it's a timeless text. If it was just about how to organize ancient Athens, we shouldn't, it would be a niche interest amongst historians, not a life-giving dialogue that the Neoplatonists and people still to this day read. So I think this is true, and Blake shows up this up in many ways. He partly, makes these statements about Plato. And he also uses words like emanation, as you're saying. And again, the emanation, so Jerusalem, for example, is the emanation of the giant Albion. And that's almost the title of one of Blake's long poems. And so this is the idea that anything which is divine, and ultimately that's all things, in its very nature, it emanates, it pours out into more. And then that more too becomes part of the divine. And so it pours out into more. And that dynamic is absolutely basic in Blake. His friendship with Thomas Taylor is, we get little glimpses of it. And one of the stories is that one day Thomas Taylor was trying to explain the Euclid's axioms to Blake, and they sort of started at the beginning, and they got, I think it's the third, which is about isosceles triangles. And Blake sort of cut him short and said, why do I need the maths? I can see what you're saying. And I don't think Blake was against mathematics. If you think of his workshop with its great high pressure presses to produce the prints, and the measurement of acids on metals and pigments and so on, there's something very precise. And Blake he always talked about the need for the clear line in art. He hated the dominant oil painting of his day, and I don't think he'd have liked people like Turner actually either. He doesn't comment on Turner, but I don't think he'd have liked Turner because that sort of rather fuzzy, impressionistic, vague sense of the divine, he would have thought was at least penultimate, at least relative. So he did love, as it were, a kind of precision, but he, not if that meant you lost sight of the beauty itself. And I think that when he had, I can imagine him and Thomas Taylor having these kind of tussles about, like we were saying before, about things and their asymmetric relationship. But it is a contested view that Blake was Neoplatonic, and I think it's partly because we've forgotten what the Neoplatonic actually is. It's taken to be this rather, the kind of creed that prefers another world and dislikes this world, and so again, many people when they're taught Plato are taught that Plato said there's a kind of perfect table in the sky somewhere, and all other tables are some sort of failed reflection of this perfect table, and it's such a travesty of Plato. But anyway, I did my PhD on Plato, so this is a whole other bugbear of mine. Yeah.
Yeah, okay. I wanted to touch on Neoplatonism just before I went into Nietzsche, because obviously Nietzsche sees Platonism as being his enemy, as he does Christianity. And so now I want to sort of launch into Nietzsche and just get your thoughts. I mean, when I read Marriage of Heaven and Hell, I was astonished at the similarities. And what's also astonishing is that it seems like Nietzsche never read Blake. So there's presumably no direct influence there. But I wanted to just read a few things that stood out to me when I read Marriage of Heaven and Hell that just sound extremely Nietzschean, and then get your comments on whether you see a similarity between Nietzsche and Blake, and maybe if there's anything that crucially distinguishes Blake from someone like Nietzsche. But first of all, so from the Marriage of Heaven and Hell, let's see. Okay, so we've already talked about contraries. Without contraries, there's no progression. Good is the passive that obeys reason. Evil is the active springing from energy. That energy called evil is alone from the body, and that reason called good is alone from the soul. And that sort of privileging, or maybe rhetorical privileging, but certainly privileging in that book of evil over good. Energy is the only life and is from the body. Reason is the bound or outward circumference of energy. Energy is eternal delight. This one I find particularly Nietzschean. Those who restrain desire do so because theirs is weak enough to be restrained, and the restrainer or reason usurps its place and governs the unwilling. And then, of course, you've got the Proverbs of Hell. The road of excess leads to the palace of wisdom. Prudence is a rich, ugly old maid courted by incapacity. He who desires but acts not breeds pestilence. Exuberance is beauty. And then a couple more from towards the end of the book. Let's see. Opposition is true friendship. It's a very, to me, very Nietzschean sort of phrase or saying. The man who never alters his opinion is like standing water and breeds reptiles of the mind. And that dialogue that he has with the angel, thy fantasy has imposed upon me, and thou oughtest to be ashamed, says the angel. To which Blake replies, we impose on one another. So the sense of sort of imposing their metaphysical systems on each other. Um, and then one law for the lion and the ox is oppression. There's also a passage where he sort of lauds great men and says that we should sort of, rather than envy or calumniate them, we should admire them. So another one that's very Nietzschean. Now, this is obviously a relatively early book, so it may be that his thought sort of changes, maybe becomes more Christian. I'm not sure over time. But what do you think about that connection between Nietzsche and Blake?
I think that they are both trying to write from the source of things rather than from systems, like you're saying. And so this aphoristic form emerges in both, because that's the way of doing it. And then, I mean, Blake is more a poet than Nietzsche was, but, Nietzsche, the also thus spoke Zarathustra could be, regarded as a kind of epic poem in a way. So I think that there are similarities, and trying to write from the energy, write from the spirit. You can feel that in both, and that partly means this skepticism of labels. Just because something is called evil by many people doesn't mean that it necessarily is evil. It might be something misunderstood. And so in the marriage of heaven and hell, it's the demons, so-called, who are much better in touch with the divine energy than the angels, so-called. And remember, this is, for Blake anyway, is the time of, a very oppressive institutional form of religiosity in England, the Church of England having a kind of civic monopoly on pretty much everything. And so it becomes a form of moralizing, which is deadening. And so, angelic behavior, which is self-congratulatory and knows itself to be in the right, is what Blake's arguing against there. And so you can see the similarities with Nietzsche as well. But I think there is this basic difference, and maybe you could pick up on two things that Nietzsche called himself. Nietzsche calls himself the Antichrist, and I think the point about the Antichrist is that not that it's clearly different from Christ, but that it's almost like Christ, but not quite. It's almost like Christ, but not quite, because it's a form of self-assertion rather than what Blake would call annihilation of the selfhood. I think that is the key difference. That at the end of the day, Blake is wanting to give himself to Christ, and he talks about Jesus and the one humanity. He wants to know of his connection with the infinite source, whereas I think Nietzsche is much more ambivalent about that, and obviously at times it's quite clear that is some sort of fantasy in the pejorative sense, and so identifying himself with the Antichrist, and I think that makes all the difference, because you might say that Nietzsche, and again Nietzsche would say this about himself, that Nietzsche is a tragic figure. And that means that in spite of all that can happen, he'll still keep saying yes to life. Whereas Blake would be a figure from the older meaning of comedy, which means that in spite of everything that tragic happening, he keeps saying yes to life because it leads back to the good from whence all things came. And so is a comedy, like in the sense of Dante's Divine Comedy. There may be a few laughs on the way too, but it's comedy in this richer ontological sense.
Mm.
Yeah, so I think you can read them side by side, but and sometimes it seems like they almost merge, but I think there's always this difference as well about Eternity's Sunrise again. I think I mean I might be wrong, but I don't think Eternity's Sunrise would be a Nietzschean expression.
It's yeah, that's a very interesting answer. I think that the second point you made is a very good one. I think the first point you made about sort of giving yourself away in that Christian sense. I think that Nietzsche would be loath to phrase it that way, but I think you do get glimpses of that in Zarathustra, the sense of overflowing, wanting to expand yourself, wanting to pour yourself out, um, even in love in certain passages. And so I do sense that there is that in Nietzsche as well. But maybe rhetorically, maybe on a conscious level, he's less likely to talk that up. Your second point, which is more about is there a return to the transcendent? That is very much downplayed in Nietzsche. I agree with that. I still think there's maybe a glimmer of it here and there, but that I found that a very illuminating answer anyway. Now I know that we're nearing the end of our time together, but I did want to ask one more question, if that's okay. So this is about, so you mentioned that, Nietzsche styles himself as Antichrist, whereas Blake is much more inclined to sort of embrace Christ or give himself up for Christ. So what does Blake believe about Christ? Earlier today, in preparation for this interview, I read his text. I believe it's an incomplete text by the looks of it, The Everlasting Gospel. And I was just struck by how radical his view of Christ was. Um, and so obviously you devote a chapter to this in the book, but it's still a little bit curious to me or puzzling to me. How would you summarize Blake's view of Jesus? And do you think it developed over time throughout his life? Do you think it did change from Marriage of Heaven and Hell, where he is a positive figure, but maybe not accorded the same reverence that he is or seems to be in Milton and Jerusalem? So yeah, so
Yeah,
summary of his view and did it develop?
I think that the expression of it does shift, and maybe this is as much a reflection of how in the early part of Blake's life he had a more youthful optimism, but then after the horrors of the French Revolution and the Napoleonic Wars, where millions die across Europe, a sort of a more darker side of humanity comes to the fore. But there is a very early statement which I think captures Blake's sense of Christ, of Jesus being the historical figure, Christ being that which is revealed in the historical figure, which is in his little pamphlet, There Is No Natural Religion, which the last plate is a phrase which again is very familiar in Orthodox Christianity before the Reformation. And the phrase is, therefore God becomes as we are, that we may be as he is. And so you've got the meeting of time becoming as we are with eternity, as he is. And, that is the summary of the significance of Jesus as a historical figure, but it becomes a timeless act of God recognized in history, because that becoming as God is the incarnation for all of us. So as a figure like Meister Eckhart would put it, and I'm sure Blake would have agreed with this, the real incarnation to worry about is not the one that happened, well, for Eckhart 1500 years ago or 2000 years ago for us, but it's the one that's continually happening now. the meeting of the infinite and the finite in us, the meeting of the eternal and the temporal in us. And so Jesus is the figure that in the Christian tradition, this is seen and recognized through. And so in the marriage of heaven and hell, Jesus is a kind of sort of hero for seeing through, say, the rules of Christianity to the spirit that the rules have tried to show, but have ultimately contained and then killed. And so there's a sort of sense of the return to the spirit, not the law, in Jesus in the marriage of heaven and hell. Then in the later poems, particularly Jerusalem that mentioned and John Albion, Jesus is a figure that comes when all else seems to be lost. When someone lays down to die because they're despairing of life wholly, the figure of Jesus appears, and it becomes a moment where all else is let go of, and the true life therefore can be seen even in extremis. And so Jesus is the figure that comes, and of course this is an echo of the theme of death and resurrection, but known as an ongoing living reality rather than a one-off moment in history that's somehow supposed to prove something. So I think that there is a continuity that Blake asserts with this statement very early in his public writing, therefore God becomes as we are, that we may be as he is. But it does take it emanates in different ways, shall we say, throughout his writing as well.
That one has a sense of sort of the incarnational aspect of the whole of creation, really. And I think in your book too, you refer to a shocking response he gives someone who asks him about Jesus, and he sort of says that he was, the incarnate. I don't remember the precise words, but he was the incarnation.
Yeah, he's talking to he's talking to this journalist who says, but do you believe Jesus was the Son of God? And Blake says, yes, and so am I, and so are you.
Yes.
Yeah, and that does go to the heart of it precisely. But again, this is not some sort of strange bit of Christian heresy. Amongst the mystics and amongst the church fathers, this is the true, fullest understanding of the incarnation.
Mm-hmm. And it does make sense.
It's only really since the Reformation, when this story's taken hold in Christian circles, that there's a massive abyss between us and God that would condemn us forever, but for this kind of rescue mission launched by the second person of the Trinity. Mm-hmm. I say it in in a slightly comic way, in the pejorative sense of comic, but nonetheless, I think it's a disaster, a disastrous sense, which is not to say we can't feel at an infinite distance from God, mm-hmm. But clearly that can happen too. But to know that very infinity that feels like a distance is another expression of the vastness of the divine. Mm-hmm. And that's the sort of what Jung would call the enantiodromia. That's the turnaround where nothing changes and yet everything changes because the perspective has changed.
And it makes a lot of sense that Blake's vision of Jesus would have developed as he matured, as he suffered, as he lost, for that very reason of just needing to have those experiences and needing to find God through those experiences, really. So that again is an illuminating answer. Okay, well that I had another question about the Hindu connection, but we won't go into that. So I just
if you wanted to touch on that,
yeah,
I'm really enjoying your questions, and just to say thanks for that, because they're very wonderful questions to engage, because clearly you want to get to the heart of these things and are seeing to the heart of these things. So it will be good just to touch, if you have the time.
Yes, I do. I do have the time,
because I think this is also it's important, because it is this part of this expansive Christianity, mm-hmm. That's in Blake. So let's go one more round.
Okay, let's do it. And thank you for the kind words as well. So in the book, this was complete news to me, so I was quite surprised by it. But you mentioned that Blake was actually one of the earliest readers of the Bhagavad Gita in English. And so I think you mentioned that he was an acquaintance of Charles Wilkins, who translated it in about 1785. And that actually had informed his works. And so I have a big interest in Hinduism myself and have done for many, many years. And so I was delighted to find this out. I have a couple of questions about this. One, the first question I'll give you them both and you can decide which order you want to answer them in. The first question would just be, how does Blake take up and maybe even transform some of the ideas that he gets from Hindu thought? So you mentioned in the book, is it Vala or Vela? But that idea,
Who knows? But I say Vala normally. Yeah.
Vala, yes, being Maya, basically, being this sense of maybe creative illusion that you find in Hinduism, um, and then contrasted with Jerusalem, sort of a positive aspect. So I'd like to hear sort of what he does with that, and if you see it as being divergent from sort of mainstream Hindu thought or being conforming to it. And then one other question, which I think we may have closed in on an answer to already in a way. Is Blake a non-dualist? Could he be described as an Advaitin, would you say?
I mean, well, just to pick up on the second question, I think in a way, but I think he would be, insofar as I've understood it, more in, say, the Kashmiri Shaivism form traditions of Advaita. So I think that, yeah, ultimately, everything is non-dual, everything's an expression of the one. But I think Blake does think the expressions matter. They're not just illusions to be got rid of. No, it's in the minute particulars, as he would put it, that you see the non-duality. So he would belong to that tradition within the range of Vedantic thought. And then this comes, relation to Vala. So Vala is one of his figures, one of his Eternals, in particularly Jerusalem, the Emanation of the Giant Albion, this long poem. And Vala divides from Jerusalem. And this dividing is a big theme in Blake's understanding of how it's a sort of another facet of emanation, but it captures both the sense of what feels like a separation from, but of course the minute you're aware of a separation is also the minute you're aware of a possible return to unity. And so you have, again, there's a kind of contrary in that brings a dynamism. And I think, and people have pointed this out, that with tangible evidence there is that Blake knew the Bhagavad Gita. Unfortunately, we don't have his copy, presuming that his friend Charles Wilkins gave him one with his annotations, which would be like complete gold dust in Blake's studies. Through his, we know he drew pictures, for example, of Brahmins, and he did a portrait of Charles Wilkins as well. So that they don't survive, but they're in catalogues. So there's absolutely no doubt of Blake's deep engagement with these things. And one way I think you can see that is in the naming of Vala, which is a pun on the veiling effects of Maya. And so that becomes Vala. And Vala goes around, as it were, when she's separated from Jerusalem and fears for her separation, throwing her veil over things. So, it's pretty clear. But what Jerusalem holds on to herself is for a reconnection that's also an expansion, so that it becomes a true emanation. So you have, Vala and Jerusalem having their own sort of disputes, their own engagements at various points in the poem. And again, I think you can see a lot of the influence of the thought of, well, maybe the Vedantic thought more generally, as well as the Bhagavad Gita in particular. But again, this shouldn't surprise us in a way. Blake lived when the East India Company was, massively forging links between India, the Indian subcontinent, and Britain, and a lot of that, of course, was extractive, and that is rightly criticised. But there was also this inflow of ideas, and that Blake lived in a time when Sanskrit was recognised as an extraordinary language, quite as remarkable as Greek and Latin. And so there was this kind of orient. I think it's sometimes called the Oriental awakening or the Oriental Renaissance that Blake lived in, and we know that he mingled very much with the great thought leaders of his time. You know, London was a relatively small place. You could walk across it in an hour or so. Still 750,000 people when he was born, expanding when he died, but nonetheless, that sort of mix of ideas. And particularly, I think, you know, if you are drawn more to the mystical, to the inner, you know, who knows, he might well have had conversations with Brahmins that came to London. There's no tangible evidence of that, but it's quite easy to surmise.
Mm. Yeah, that um, I guess you get in Advaita, well, in Vedanta, you get the sort of more rigid, like deny the world as illusion strain. But then you do get that, like you referred to Kashmir Shaivism. I'm a big admirer of Sri Ramakrishna, if you're familiar with him, who really emphasized that the world and God are not different. Like they are the same. And so I think he has one particular parable where he says you climb to the roof of the house and you put one step behind the other, and you see that they're each made of brick dust and mortar and bricks, and then you come to the top and you see that everything is made of it. God is everything. Um, he also says, like Shiva and Shakti are one. Shiva is fire and Shakti is its power to burn. For that reason, I think that's one of the ways I think that Nietzsche actually glimpses the divine is he's a worshipper of Shakti, and he kind of marries this divine figure at the culmination of Zarathustra as well. So this is it really rich and engaging for me because it brings my fascination I have with Christianity, Hinduism, and Nietzsche all together in one. So I'm definitely going to read more of Blake and maybe with the help of some commentaries as well. I have to say your book helped me certainly with the Book of Reason to grapple with that. But that was all the questions that I had today. So thank you very, very much for your time, Mark. And I think that for the viewers, anyone watching this, I would strongly, strongly recommend getting this book if you're at all interested in the kind of things we've been talking about today, if you're interested in Blake. And I'll put a link to the book. I'll put a link to your website, Mark, as well. And yeah, I'm just really appreciative of your time in this fascinating conversation that we've had today.
Yeah, well, look, again, thanks to you. It's wonderful to engage and to meet, you know, with this richness and this enthusiasm. And, you know, I love what you just said there about how a fascination, you know, in traditions other than the Christian can illuminate that which is going on within Christianity. And I feel this is a really important imperative for our times. And it's one of the reasons why Blake is so important, because this living, dynamic, I use the word mystical, I hope it's an adequate word, form of Christianity is so important for countering the sort of moralizing tendency, which is deadening. And that's why people don't think to turn to it when they're seeking these things. But the wonderful thing about Blake, you know, I began by saying he walked the streets of South London, and you know, there is something about being able to breathe the air that's closest to you, and finding that Christianity in this form, you know, can be invigorating, can bring the spirit, which you find in other traditions as well. And so using those other traditions and as a way of reviving one's own, I think this is a wonderful way to go. So look, thanks so much for, it's great to share it because you know that as much as me. And so, yeah, I feel that, I hope that our listeners have too. That's one of the great things about this dialogue form, I think, that something emerges between us, really. It's
Yes.
not one of us saying something, but it's something emerging between us. So I appreciate that.